Well, now, as we've been discussing, there's much uncertainty about the second phase of the ceasefire in Gaza. After nearly 16 months of war, the humanitarian situation there remains dire. Author and journalist Peter Beinart believes equality between Israelis and Palestinians is the only way to secure peace and safety for good. It's something he addresses in his new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And he joins Michelle Martin to discuss.
Thanks, Beinart. Peter Beinart, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you.
You open your latest book with what you call a letter to a former friend. It's heartbreaking. But will you just tell us about this letter? And why is this a former friend?
So my public views of opposition to the war in Gaza and opposition to the idea of a state that gives Jews rights that Palestinians don't have is a very, very unpopular view in certain elements of the American Jewish community and many of the institutions in which I spend my life because I'm an observant Jew. And so Jewish institutions structure my life. And in those institutions, there are many people who I care about a great deal who feel very betrayed by my views, especially because they're expressed so publicly. And people said many times, Peter, I feel like you are putting my family at risk. And so I wanted to write this book for those people to try to explain why I see things so differently, why I feel like our organized community has gone so profoundly wrong, and why that I believe that what we're doing and what we're supporting in Israel's treatment of Palestinians and Israel's destruction of Gaza is not just a violation of our best ethical and religious traditions, but ultimately endangers us.
This latest book is titled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. It's not being Jewish after October 7th. It's not being Jewish after 1947. Why after the destruction of Gaza? Why is that the beginning point?
Because I think that the Jewish community feels and wrestles with the horror of October 7th. That's for all of us omnipresent, including for myself, one of the most traumatic days of my life. I know people are already wrestling with the horror of that. But what led me to write this book was seeing so many good and decent people that I know who day after day after day somehow seemed to be able to block out the screams of what was happening in Gaza. Like I was looking at my computer screen every day and also hearing from people who had family in Gaza. And every day I was thinking, I can't believe that this is happening, right? Most of the buildings are being destroyed. Most of the schools, most of the hospitals, most of the agriculture, the number of children who are being killed just dwarfs what we've seen in Ukraine or almost any conflict of the 21st century, more child amputees than any other place in modern history. And I look at my community that I love and I see that people are justifying this. Maybe they're saying it's unfortunate, but they're also saying it's necessary. And to me, that reflects an unwillingness to truly face what is being done in our name as Jews.
How did this understanding start for you? Because you have a reputation as a person who has long been concerned about Israel's role in the world, the way it manages its governance of its territories, and the story it tells the world about itself.
I was raised in a family where Israel was very, very important, as a sense of security, that there was a state for Jews after the Holocaust. My father, my grandfather, I remember how much they loved to be in Israel. When I started going to Israel as a kid, I also loved being there. When you're used to being this really small minority and then you go to like a Jewish civilization where everything you see reflects your identity and your culture, it's a very powerful experience. But I had no experience with what all this meant for Palestinians. That was completely off of my radar screen. It wasn't until my 30s, I'm embarrassed to say, so late in my life, that I first went to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank to see what Israel meant for them. And on the first day, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to rethink some things, that I had no idea what it really meant for people to live under the control of a state where they had no rights, where they couldn't become citizens, where they couldn't vote, where they lived under military law, where they needed military permission to travel. And it was that experience with Palestinians that made me rethink what it means to me to try to live ethically as a Jew.
Do you remember what it is that you saw literally on those first days that awakened this, I don't know any other way to call it, but yes, a moral crisis in you?
I remember talking to a woman, I write about it in the book, and she had two daughters, and then they had a son. And then when she had a son, her daughters heard that she had a son, the daughters started crying hysterically because in their village, the boys would throw stones at Israeli soldiers. And the Israeli army would then go in the middle of the night and pull boys out of their homes. They didn't necessarily know who threw the stones, but they knew that probably that boy could inform on the other boys, even if it wasn't him. And then they would hold them you can, because they live under military law, you can be held under indefinite detention without family, without a lawyer, often physically harmed for days. And I saw that fear, and it made me realize, what does it mean to live under the control of a state that has life and death power over you, but is not accountable to you at all? You can't vote. You don't live under the same law as your Jewish neighbors. It's a terrifying experience to be powerless vis-a-vis a state that has control over you. And I had never really internalized that. I'd never been able to imagine myself in that place.
Yeah, interestingly, you are actually from South Africa. Your family's from South Africa. And I just wonder how,
Yes.
what role that played in your understanding of these things.
What happened is after I started to learn from Palestinians and read Palestinian writing and get an understanding of what Israel had meant for Palestinians, I started to hear echoes of what I heard white South Africans say during apartheid, because white South Africans almost universally were convinced that if black people got the right to vote, that their lives would be in grave danger. It was considered just obvious that basically apartheid was what kept white people safe because, Nelson Mandela did not believe in nonviolence. The African National Congress used armed resistance. They were called a terrorist organization by the United States government. They were being funded by the Soviet Union. It looked terrifying to white people. And so I kept thinking, why were all of those white South Africans, including people in my own family, why were they wrong? Why actually were white people not slaughtered? Why did the ANC's military wing disband after the end of apartheid? And the reason, I think, is that it wasn't necessary anymore, because when people have the right to vote, when they can get the government to listen to them without having to take up arms, most people are much, much happier doing that than having to put their lives at risk, which is why when you give people equality under the law, things become safer. And so that began to transform the way I heard these debates in the Jewish community, where people always say, unless we have a state in which we have legal superiority, we can't be safe.
Really, this book is directed toward Jewish people. Really. I mean, and so I want to talk about what you call the story that Jewish people tell themselves about being history's permanent, virtuous victims. What do you mean by that?
I mean that I think that oftentimes, because of our extremely traumatic history, there is a tendency in Jewish discourse to imagine that the only role that we play vis-a-vis other people in the world is as the role of victims. So after October 7th, the horror of October 7th, people immediately started calling it a pogrom, which was essentially referring to it as a kind of continuation of the assaults on Jews in the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, as if the Palestinians are the reincarnation of these anti-Semites from Europe a century ago, or indeed even the reincarnation of the Nazis, right? But the conditions in Israel-Palestine are completely different. You can't understand the violence against Jews in Europe without understanding that Jews were legally inferior. In Israel-Palestine, it's Palestinians who are legally inferior. Jews have legal supremacy over Palestinians. And so if you want to understand this terrible act of violence by Hamas, you have to be willing to face the fact that Palestinians live without basic rights. And if you ignore that fact, you're basically just suggesting that Palestinians are the reincarnation of the Jew haters of old. They are not people in and of themselves that you need to actually try to understand.
And you also say that, well, let's just talk about something that is actually it's a very delicate thing to speak about in any circumstance. But many people do compare the atrocities of a Hamas attack on October 7th to the events of the Holocaust. And people, talking about the Holocaust is always sort of very fraught, no matter where you are. But you argue that this isn't quite the right analogy to invoke. And why is that?
Again, because you can't understand the Holocaust without understanding the fact that Jews were Europe's other, the subordinated class for centuries. October 7th is much more, in my mind, like an inhumane, brutal attack by people who are oppressed, right? And this happens tragically throughout history. Think about America in the 19th century, when Native Americans had been forced off their land, crowded into smaller and smaller reservations. When they had the opportunity to fight back, oftentimes they didn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. They killed men, women, and children in horrifying ways, just like Hamas did in horrifying ways. Palestinians in Gaza, this doesn't get discussed enough in the American media. Palestinians in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're the descendants of refugees that were forced out of what's now Israel. Many of them can see from Gaza their lands in which they lived. Now they live in a place that's called an open-air prison by Human Rights Watch. My friend Mohammed Shahada told me that everyone he knew growing up in Gaza had contemplated suicide. Because there was no hope for them to have a decent life. If you want to make sure that we never have October 7th again, God forbid, you have to deal with that underlying oppression. Because when you inflict violence on people, the structural violence that Israel has inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza and beyond, you ultimately make everybody less safe.
Peter, one of the points that you make in your book is that criticizing the way Israel conducts itself on the world stage and the way Israel conducts itself within Gaza and the West Bank is not the same as being anti-Semitic, okay? But you can acknowledge, can you not, that Hamas and Hezbollah that Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist groups have been or are anti-Semitic and want to kill Jews. So how should we think about that?
The way I think about it is that when people are denied their rights, they resist that oppression, and they do so in a range of ways, some of which are ethical and humane, some of which are unethical and inhumane, some of which sometimes they do so in a spirit of equality and the recognition of the humanity of all people, and sometimes they do so in the case of Hezbollah and Hamas, in an Islamist ideology, which is itself supremacist, because it believes that there should be an Islamic state in which Muslims have rights that are superior to Christians and Jews. And so it seems to me the right way to respond to this is, if you want to weaken Hamas, if you want to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah, you have to support Palestinians who are fighting for their freedom in ways that are ethical, in ways that are consistent with international law, in ways that don't target Israeli civilians. And when I look at what Israel and America have done, look at how they respond when Palestinians appeal nonviolently, when they try to go to the UN or to international courts, or when they call for boycotts or divestment and sanctions in the spirit of the anti-apartheid movement, or when they do nonviolent marches like the Great March of Return, or even when they collaborate with Israel in order to convince Israel that they can be trusted by working cooperatively with the Israeli military, as the Palestinian Authority does. Israel defeats all of those efforts. Palestinians have not gained anything from those ethical nonviolent struggles. So if we are horrified by October 7th and we oppose the ideology of Hamas and we don't want a single Israeli Jew to die, we are incumbent, it seems to me, on us to support ethical, humane, nonviolent Palestinian resistance, to show Palestinians that there's a better way. And I fear that the United States government and Israel and the organized American Jewish community has done exactly the opposite.
Is it your view that more people share your view than are willing to express it publicly, particularly in the wake of October 7th? Yes. I remember a conversation that I had with a young college student who is observant, like yourself, right. Deeply observant, and said that in the wake of October 7th, she said to her parents, well, didn't we want a place where we could be safe and free? Don't Palestinians want the same thing? They want a place where they can be safe and free. Right. And she told me that her parents said to her, now is not the time.
Polling shows actually that, particularly among younger American Jews, that a remarkably high percentage of young American Jews say things like they think Israel is an apartheid state. And there was a fascinating poll done by a Canadian political scientist, Mira Sukharov, where she asked American Jews if they consider themselves, would you consider yourself a Zionist if Zionism means that Israeli Jews have more rights than Palestinians? Most American Jews said no. So there are undoubtedly a lot of very passionate supporters of the state of Israel and of what is and of this war. But there's also a climate of fear that exists in the American Jewish community. Rabbis know that if you publicly criticize Israel too harshly, you very may well lose your job. Or if you're a teacher at a Jewish school or a Jewish camp, people know this very well. And so oftentimes people suppress what they say young American Jewish kids know this as well, that the consequences for them could be very severe. And so I think that there's much more division and much more diversity of opinion among American Jews than you might sometimes know, because sometimes people are afraid to express it.
One of the things that we haven't talked about yet, though, just I do want to talk about, is this whole question of who is indigenous. Like, who are the indigenous people, right?
Yes.
And, you know, one of the arguments that's emerged is that that describes Israel as a settler colonial state. It sort of suggests that these are people who came from someplace else and planted themselves on the indigenous people, displaced them, killed them, oppressed them, etc. But then other people argue that Jews also have indigenous rights to this land. So how do you think about that?
I think both of these things can be true. Nobody needs to tell me that Jews have a deep and profound ancient spiritual connection to this place. When I woke up this morning, I prayed a liturgy which spoke about a desire to return to the land of Israel. It's very, very deep within our tradition. But it's also the case that the Zionist movement was created in the late 19th and early 20th century by Europeans who referred to themselves as colonists. Theodore Herzl writes to Cecil Rhodes, the arch-imperialist of Southern Africa, and says, we have a colonial project here. It's just like yours. Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, Netanyahu's own tradition. Colonial was a positive term for them. It meant bringing modernity to a backward part of the world. And people say, wait a second, it can't be settler colonial if people have deep roots in that place. Cornel West's answer to that is to cite Liberia. Right? The people who colonized Liberia were enslaved Black Americans who had come from West Africa. They also had roots in that place. But when they went back to create a state in Liberia, they oppressed the native populations there because they also had notions of themselves as kind of coming from a superior society and wanting to rule. So these two things can both be the case. And as you said, Jews have the right to live equally and safely in Israel-Palestine. I believe that very, very deeply, but that doesn't mean you have the right to superiority over another people.
What is your vision for this land?
Israel-Palestine is a binational society. You have two groups that both see themselves as nations, that speak a foreign language. That would have to be represented in government. So might be a binational democracy. But the principle that I believe is that wherever Jews and Palestinians live alongside one another, they should live equally under the law. And my hope, I don't know if I'll ever see it, is that when we look at what happened in South Africa and we look at that South African legal team that went to the International Court of Justice, and there were white people and Black people and Indian people and people and of all different backgrounds, and they were saying, "Look at us. We overcame supremacy, and we are now fighting to fight for that principle around the world of human equality." That's my dream of what we could have among Palestinians and Israelis. A legal team of Palestinian and Israeli Jews saying, "We overcame of supremacy. We live together in equality, and what we accomplish can be now an inspiration for the world." And I really believe the world needs that inspiration today.
Peter Beinart, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Now, could Democrats learn from the MAGA movement? That's the question our next guest is asking in his latest piece for The New Yorker. Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Charles Duhigg argues that recent right-leaning movements have thrived by building local networks with lasting community impacts. While on the other hand, he says Democrats have focused on large, flashy shows of force that have failed to produce durable impact. He explains to Michelle Martin what he believes it would take for the left to build broader, more resilient coalitions.
Thanks, Bianna. Charles Duhigg, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Your writing for The New Yorker often kind of unpacks the way systems work, right? How does the system actually work? In your latest piece, it's titled, "What MAGA Can Teach Democrats About Organizing and Infighting." What made you think about that?
Well, I was really curious about why the Democrats have obviously been turning people out into the streets for the last 8 years, and in some of the largest protests we've ever seen. And yet Donald Trump's victory, most recent victory, and the fact that MAGA has such a sustainable life around it made me curious what was going on, because I didn't see a lot of MAGA protests. And as I got deeper into this, I realized that there was a science behind social movements. There's a science behind why some movements attract millions of people and sustain, and why others are a flash in the pan and disappear.
You make an interesting point, because you remember when Donald Trump and Kamala Harris had their debate. Kamala Harris, the Democrat, correctly pointed out that Trump's rallies weren't that successful. Like, they were having to find smaller venues. A lot of people would leave early. And a lot of people sort of saw that as a sign of kind of waning interest. And that turned out not to be true at all. And as a tool of analysis, you open the piece by contrasting DARE, which is this nationally funded, top-down anti-drug program that spread rapidly through the schools in the 1980s. And you contrast that with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which is a volunteer-driven group that grew unevenly after a personal tragedy. What made you think of those two groups?
Well, I think they're perfect examples of what are known within the academic literature about social movements of mobilizing and organizing. DARE was really good at mobilizing, right? They could get millions of people to show up for rallies. They got President Ronald Reagan to declare the first National DARE Day. They got lots of donations. But over time, the program just kind of petered out. It wasn't very effective at changing people's behavior. And much more so, schools just abandoned it. MAD, on the other hand, was really good at what's known as organizing, pushing down leadership, training local people to build communities and become leaders in their own right. And in doing so, building these durable communities that end up having prolonged impact. And when we look at the contemporary politics, what we see is the same thing. Democrats are very, very good at mobilization, right? They're very good at turning people out into the streets and having these large rallies. But when everyone goes home, they stop talking to each other. They don't make new connections at those rallies. They feel like they've done their part. And so they stop working hard. Whereas on the Republican side, very much under noticed and quietly, MAGA has spent years and years building a network of small groups that work on local levels that have empowered tens of thousands and millions of people to become leaders of the conservative ideas within their own community. And in doing so, they've built a very sustainable, very durable movement that will, frankly, outlast Donald Trump.
You write, for a social movement to create real change, it helps to be skilled at both mobilizing and organizing. But that doesn't mean that both skills are equally important. How did you kind of come up with that idea?
Well, there's a academic I love named Liz McKenna at Harvard who says that protest is a tactic in search of a strategy. And what she means by that is that when we protest, it should be the outgrowth of a community that's built together and has become outraged and wants to take to the streets. The protest is not the goal of the movement. The protest is a symptom that you have a community that's coming together and is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, when you prioritize that protest, when you push people into the streets, when you use Twitter and the internet to organize and thereby scale very quickly, but sidestep the infrastructure building that's really, really important to making a movement durable, that's when you get what we have right now, which is that people feel very passionate on the Democratic side about being anti-Trump and standing up against ICE. And yet, we're not seeing the widespread change that those people had hoped for, because they're also not at the same time organizing and building those communities that allow people to work day in, day out, every week with their neighbors to create change.
Well, that's one of the weird ironies that you point out in your piece is that many right-leaning groups studied and adapted strategies that were first perfected by Democrats. How did the right-leaning groups figure out what to do? And how did Democratic or / left-leaning groups lose it?
Absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, for the contemporary period, we can go back to Barack Obama's election in 2008, right? At the time, Barack Obama basically turned campaign conventional wisdom on its head by saying, instead of telling volunteers what we're going to do, we're just going to make them into franchisees of the campaign and say, do whatever you think is best. Take the leadership initiative yourself. Go out and experiment with things. And as a result, they were able to get over 2 million volunteers who turned to their neighbors over 25 million times to encourage them to vote for Obama, and brought about one of the sweeping victories for Democrats in both the legislature and the White House. But at that moment, there two things happened. First of all, we start to see the roots of the Tea Party, and the Tea Party was a very decentralized movement that ended up being very, very successful. And also you saw folks like Ralph Reed, the former head of the Christian Coalition, look at the Obama election and say, look, they're out organizing us. We got to get better at this. So what Ralph Reed did is start an organization known as the Faith and Family Coalition that very much was modeled on the Obama playbook, but for the right. And in fact, one of the things that many of these groups do, including Turning Point USA, the Charlie Kirk organization, is that when a leader joins their group, they make them read this book called Groundbreakers, which is all about the Obama campaign and very glowingly about the Obama campaign. And they say, don't pay attention to the ideology, just steal the ideas about organizing. And so with the Tea Party and groups like the Faith and Freedom Coalition and Turning Point USA, we saw a prolonged emphasis on creating these small groups across the nation of neighbors who are coming together in order to be active, not just on politics, but on all types of things. Faith and Freedom has expanded by focusing on evangelical churches and gun clubs and homeschooling organizations. And in doing so, what they've learned is that when neighbors have one issue they care about, like guns, then it's much easier to persuade them when the election rolls around to vote for the Republican candidate. But the point is they're doing year-round organizing.
But the other point that you make in the piece is that MAGA's strength comes in part from a tolerance for internal disagreement. And this is something that you're hearing Democrats complain about constantly, particularly national Democrats, is this sort of a stringency around opinion that is enforced.
Yeah, a purity test.
But you look at the Women's March, for example, which fell apart, which is a huge mobilization in the wake of Trump's first election. Huge mobilization, far outstripped in numbers the people who attended his first inauguration. And the group fell apart over all these sort of internal disagreements about who was right and issues like sort of Israel. You know what's interesting, though, is that you really don't, I'm based in Washington, so I don't get the sense that Donald Trump tolerates a lot of disagreement about anything. So it's important. So it's interesting that, you know, you're saying that the actual organizing structure that keeps him alive and viable politically actually does. Can you say just a little bit more about how that works on the ground?
It's important to distinguish between MAGA and Donald Trump. You're exactly right. Donald Trump brooks no dissent within his group. And yet, if you look at the MAGA movement, they welcome almost everyone as long as you're willing to put on the red hat, right? And for many of them, they actually opposed Trump when he first rose up in the first presidential campaign. And they've now come around to being boosters of his because he's the guy who's winning. It's great to jump on his coattails. But MAGA is a very different movement from Donald Trump as himself. And you're exactly right. MAGA says if you wear the red hat, you're allowed in. We don't care who you date. We don't care who you love. We don't care if you're pro-choice or pro-life. We don't care if you're pro-trans rights or anti-trans rights. As long as you wear the red hat, you're welcome within our camp. And if we contrast that with what's happening oftentimes on the left, what we see are these purity tests, right? That if you are a pro-life Democrat, you are excluded from almost every social organization that should be welcoming you. If you're someone who has questions about DEI initiatives or January 6th, or says, you know, I don't like Elon Musk, but maybe shaking up the government, maybe there's something there, there's no place for you to really participate in the Democrats, and they make you feel like you are excluded. What we know about political movements and political parties is that they succeed when they become big tents. And MAGA is very focused on being a big tent. All you have to do is say you're going to vote for the guy at the top of the Republican ticket and you're a member. Democrats are much more focused on ideological purity, and it's to the detriment of the party.
How did that start? How did it happen that somebody like Obama led this movement that was very inclusive, and then all of it became sort of ossified into these purity tests? How did that happen? Do you have a sense?
I think two things happened. I think that first was the election of Donald Trump was such an overwhelming shock to the democratic system that Democrats started saying, we absolutely have to be unified against Donald Trump. We have to show that there's no dissent within our ranks because we feel like that's the way that we prove that we are the resistance. And that's an understandable instinct, but it's exactly the wrong thing to do. And then on top of that, is COVID and the racial reckoning that happened after George Floyd. There was a lot of upheaval in how we thought about social issues. And you'll remember during COVID that it became a sign of faith on the left that you should absolutely wear a mask and that we should close the schools. And states, Republican states, that didn't enforce mask wearing and didn't close their schools were almost demonized. And now we know, looking back, this is a complicated issue. It's a sophisticated issue. Some people should be wearing masks, others don't have to. Maybe in some places we close schools, in other places we shouldn't close schools. But there was this emphasis on unity on the left that became dogmatic. And we still haven't grown out of that. In fact, the fact that Donald Trump won by being anti-woke is evidence of how much this perception of a need for ideological purity still exists. And people are either endorsing it or reacting in contrast to it. But it's important to note that this hasn't always been true, as you point out. It wasn't true under Obama. It wasn't true under Clinton. We all remember the Sister Souljah moment, right? When Clinton very visibly broke with some of the core constituencies of the Democratic Party. This used to be something that we saw as a good sign that a party is alive and is breathing and is changing. And the Democrats need to get back to that if they want to succeed.
And what about Minneapolis? I mean, we've seen an intense kind of grassroots mobilization. These are people saying, this is unacceptable to me. My neighbors are being harassed and persecuted. I'm not tolerating this. And this is, of course, after 2 U.S. citizens have been shot by federal agents under circumstances that the people who witnessed this consider absolutely unacceptable, and that many people have now seen for themselves. So what do you make of it? Did you think this has some meaningful impact or not?
Absolutely. And what's interesting about Minneapolis is that it's not all groups on the left that have ignored the wisdom of grassroots organizing. And in fact, in Minneapolis, we see a number of groups that for years now have been organizing grassroots in local communities. One of my favorites is a group named Isaiah, which has brought together childcare workers, college students, East African refugees, Islamic centers and churches, groups that normally would never come together. Isaiah has been bringing them together for over a decade and has been helping them organize among themselves and saying, look, you share values together. And if we work together, we become stronger. And those are the groups that right now are leading this mobilization. A social movement can't exist without both organizing and mobilizing. That mobilizing is really important. But what's happened in Minneapolis is that the organizing has been going on for a decade on the left. And so now when they mobilize, it's not just a one-day show up and blow your whistle. It's a prolonged, consistent attempt to change what is happening in that city and in this nation. And it's that durability, those unsung heroes of local people who show up and take out their phones and blow their whistles day after day after day because they see their friends there, because they see their neighbors there. That is what creates real change.
Do you see this as having an impact more broadly on sort of organizing elsewhere? I'm thinking in New York, for example, the election of the current mayor, Zoran Mamdani. I mean, nobody thought the smart money was not on this person. And it just seemed very much to be a matter of people organizing. And now the question becomes, do his strategies for getting elected translate elsewhere?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And politicians are jealous of nothing like success in this world, right? So every single politician, particularly Democrat, watched the Mamdani campaign and said, why did this guy win? How can I imitate that? They're watching what's happening in Minnesota right now. And they're saying, listen, like these are the types of people that I want to show up to fight for me, to fight for my candidacy, to fight for the policies I care about. What happened there that made this place so special that we see such a prolonged turnout? So yes, absolutely. Everyone is paying attention to the fact that local organizing seems to be the key to sustainable victory. And I think what you're going to see in these midterms this year, as well as in the presidential election that's coming up, is you're going to see a much greater emphasis on spending money and attention on local areas and local leaders rather than national campaigns. We're not going to see another situation like Kamala Harris, where $2 billion was spent trying to elect her, while local smaller organizations basically couldn't get any money. In fact, we're going to see the reverse of that because everyone realizes it's those small local organizations that work year round. Those are the trusted messengers. Those are the people who can convince people to vote.
Before I let you go, Gallup polling found a new high in the number of people identifying as independents. It says 45% of Americans now identify as political independents, and that suggests, frustration with both parties. If that is the case, then what's the way to sort of organize to achieve results for a political party? Because that generally is the way politics is conducted in this country.
Absolutely. And I think you have to be clear about what a party's values are. Listen, as someone who studies politics and watches it, I don't know what the values of the Democratic Party are right now, right? Except for being anti-Trump. I don't know exactly what they're believe in, what they think the future should look like. And on the right, among Republicans, there's a real disenchantment because they don't know what the values of the Republican Party are, except for saying, I'm willing to put on the red hat and I'm willing to vote for Trump. Neither party has done a really good job of elucidating what their values are and why you should support them rather than choose the lesser of two evils. And that's what the primary is going to be. We are going to see a battle among many, many candidates running for president over what the values of the Democrats ought to be and what the values of the Republicans ought to be and how we elucidate those and clarify those. Because ultimately, people need something to vote for. They need to say, I'm a Democrat because I believe in what the Democrats are saying. Or I'm a Republican because I believe in the values of the Republican Party. And until those are elucidated, you're going to see people being independent and saying, I don't identify with either party because I don't really know what either party is.
Charles Duhigg, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
And now, after years of turmoil at Columbia, the university has named a new president, legal scholar Jennifer Nukin. You'll recall the school was home to major protests after October 7th, and now, along with other U.S. higher learning institutions, it is struggling to manage threats from the Trump administration. Lee Bollinger is one of America's most well-known academic leaders, including as Columbia's president for over 20 years. And his new book, University: A Reckoning, is a call for academic institutions to stand up against the pressure from the White House. Here he is with Michelle Martin.
Thanks, Bianna. Lee Bollinger, thank you so much for talking with us.
My pleasure.
I should say Mr. President, because you've led two of our most prestigious and competitive universities, the University of Michigan and Columbia University. And I also should mention that these were not placid times when you were leading these institutions. There were student protests, there was congressional scrutiny, there was political pressure, there were sort of political currents. But obviously, you wrote this book thinking that there's something special about this moment. So what is it about this moment that strikes you as different?
Well, I think the first thing is the federal government assault and intrusion into the academic affairs of universities. So that has not really happened, certainly not to this degree, for decades. I mean, you really have to go back to the McCarthy period, which was really about one senator leading a campaign of intolerance. You have to go back to that for something comparable. And so the level of intrusion, the threat to academic freedom, the need to think about universities and their role in the Constitution and the First Amendment is much more imperative today than it really has been in modern history. So that's really the precipitating reason for the book.
In your book, you write, we are, in short, witnessing a tectonic shift in America toward the use of authoritarian tactics that threaten our democratic form of government. The university is among the first, along with the press, of the major independent institutions in society to feel the brunt of this new and frightening transformation. I mean, so your point here is that, yes, the universities and the press are on the leading edge of this, but this is really about democracy. What convinces you of that? Why do you say that?
I think it's both about democracy and about fundamental values in the country. I mean, we've seen from the very start of the administration efforts to try to silence and really attack law firms, media, civil service, independent agencies that provide the nation with objective information like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then universities. The business community has also faced this. If there's any kind of opposition there's an effort to come down very hard on them and to try to silence them. So this is something that you really cannot have if you're going to be committed to a democracy and if you're going to be committed to a nation that values knowledge and independent information and knowledge. And that's where we have been for the past century. And it would be a tragedy to lose that.
As a person who, presumably just through your own work, as a scholar, as a lawyer, as a leader of these prominent institutions, you've met a lot of these industry leaders. And one of the things that you pointed out is that a lot of them folded over pretty fast. Amazon, was going to or talked about having some sort of indicator on their website of the cost of the Trump administration's sort of tariff scheme on different products. And of course, he threatened them and they immediately folded. A number of law firms, right? Some of the finest, most distinguished lawyers in the country, he threatened them. They folded. I'm just curious why you think they've capitulated so quickly.
Yeah. So I think this has come, the whole sort of affair has taken people by surprise. Mm-hmm. People have been shocked by the level of assault on basic values and basic institutions. And so we were not prepared for it. I think it's just, a combination of it's very, very difficult to face a situation in which the government's full power, which is immense, can be brought down on you and face what everybody will always say, an existential choice. Do you capitulate? Do you try to find a way out of this, even if that means sacrificing some of your values? Or do you stand up and try to fight back? But it's a really hard problem, and I'm very sympathetic to the people who have felt and institutions who have felt that they had to find a way to save their institutions by negotiation and conciliation. But it is the case that the only way in which you can effectively counter this is by collective action. It's not by an individual institution or a single sector of the society. Everybody who writes about the democracies, the end of democracies, and so on, all the scholarship points out that it's only when civil society broadly sort of acts and rises up and said this cannot stand, that you really have effective resistance.
A lot of people, see universities in lots of different ways. Some people see colleges and universities as places you go to learn stuff so you can get a job. They're engines of the economy. Why should someone, perhaps who didn't have the chance to go to a university, embrace that idea?
I think people understand in their hearts that having major institutions, but of all kinds, from community colleges all the way through to the highest research universities, that it is really valuable for the society to have this kind of effort, human effort, to expand knowledge, because it benefits the society in all kinds of ways. Everything from economic development to simply making it possible to understand life. And it applies not just to the people who come and are students or to the faculty who are there, but it benefits everybody in the society. I think also that, there is a campaign that's been going on for many years of people who want to characterize universities as in very negative stereotypes, as filled with intolerance, ideological, not scholarly, too costly, et cetera, et cetera. And while there are fair criticisms about universities, many of which I have made myself, the fact of the matter is, if you look at all the parts of the society and you say which ones have the most integrity in pursuing what their mission is, I think universities are at the very forefront of that. And the proof is, in part, that everybody in the world wants to come and attend universities in America because they really are the standard for this.
Well, they did. That might not be the case anymore. I mean, the number of international students coming to the United States has really fallen precipitously. It's interesting. The irony being,
but not because of the quality of universities.
But because of the political environment. The irony is that these concrete financial pressures being placed on universities are having a deleterious effect on kind of the research flow. We see that, top scholars' research dollars are flowing to, Canada, to China. Some $400 million in grants and contracts frozen at Columbia, $510 million at Brown, $1 billion at Cornell, $790 million at Northwestern, much of it tied to demands about governance or compliance. What do you think the consequence of this is going to be down the line?
This idea of the Trump administration of suspending that kind of funding, for that kind of research is foolhardy, but it's also striking at the basic values that we have committed ourselves to. And it may sound idealistic, but the First Amendment, the Constitution of the country, has made it very clear that the value of knowledge and the preservation of democracy, the making it possible to be a democracy, which is very, very difficult to do, that these are what the country is committed to. And the things we're talking about, Michelle, of fundamental research in these areas and beyond, in the liberal arts as well, that's threatened by this kind of use of the lever of funding to accomplish intrusions into pure academic decision-making, faculty, students, policies of the universities.
The fact is that on the one hand, there are people, even if you accept what a lot of people believe, which is that the campus climate is just a pretext for an authoritarian impulse. There are still a lot of people who feel, and certainly have felt, particularly, let's just say, in the wake of the Gaza war, that there are students who are just under attack on some of these campuses, and that they have felt silenced, and some of them have felt harassed and deeply unwelcome. And I just wonder how you sort of square those two, I don't want to call it realities, but two phenomena. Well, let's just sort of call it that. How do you square those two things?
So there's no question over the past year and a half, we faced an incredibly difficult situation on American campuses, but also in the society generally, in trying to understand and deal with questions of policy and principle with the Israeli, Palestinian, Hamas issues, but also with race in America, with abortion in America, rights of abortion. I mean, these are incredibly difficult issues for people to address, and when that happens, unfortunately, there are excesses. And you have to be very clear if you are in an institution or if you run an institution that excesses are unacceptable and will be treated as such. But you also have to understand that you have to have very clear ideas about excesses. The First Amendment over the past century, again, has said, the court has held over many decisions, conservatives, liberals alike, that hate speech, that anti-Semitic, that racist speech, that sexist, misogynistic speech will be protected by the First Amendment, just like any other idea. That's a very, very significant choice and a very difficult one, and something that I've written about over the course of my career. Universities, public universities, are bound by that because they're bound by the First Amendment. Private universities have made a choice they too will be bound by the First Amendment. What that means is that when you are having debates about public issues on campuses and you're committed to a First Amendment approach, you may end up with very, very bad speech being spoken, which is horrible for many people to have to deal with and horrible for the community at large. But you cannot say that that is itself something that the universities have failed to correct for, when in fact the commitment has been in the society and now on campuses to live by First Amendment for all kinds of reasons.
In your essay for The Atlantic last May, you wrote that strategies of appeasement never work out. At some point, when sanity returns, you will be seen as having sacrificed your principles when under pressure, and that will undermine your case forever. So you draw a contrast between universities that negotiated settlements in Harvard, which chose to resist and won an injunction, blocking what a judge called an arbitrary and capricious funding suspension. Based on what you've seen, has Harvard gotten it right so far? And is that a path that others should follow?
Universities, like other institutions, were surprised and shocked by the level of intrusion and demands and the threats that they faced. Completely understandable, in my view, that universities would respond in different ways, and it would be very difficult to organize collective action. Myself, I think that the Harvard approach was the right one, especially for Harvard, because the level of intrusion was much more than for other universities, at least so far. So I do think, and the point of this book is to try to say that universities need to be much clearer about what their identity is in the society, their role and responsibilities. They need to make that claim, and they need to do it in various ways, but through the courts and the First Amendment and law is a primary way. So yes, I think that standing up and articulating your values and making your defense is the right approach.
And I recognize that this has to be an awkward question for you as the former leader of this institution, but you do realize that for many people, Columbia is the poster child for appeasement.
So I've made a deliberate choice not to criticize directly, criticize my institution and the one that I led for 21 years. One has to be, as I said, very sympathetic with institutions who are trying to struggle with how to deal with the attacks that they have endured.
So what do you think people should do right now? People who share the perspective that you share, people who share the concern, the deep concern that you've articulated, and people who also share the love of knowledge and of free thought that you've articulated.
So I think we need to settle on the core identity of what universities are. So it's just critical to me that we can't fall for this idea that universities are just businesses or that they are only for elites, that, all of these standard criticism. It really is important that universities say who they are and say that with conviction. I think it's also important that universities find ways to act together. This kind of collective action is critical, but it also has to be across sectors, so it has to be with the press. Michelle, you would have to agree, I think, that the press has also failed to develop a collective kind of response to the various intrusions. Same with law firms, same with businesses. Anybody who is a scholar of democracy and how you preserve it in the face of attempts to undermine democracy will say that it's only when civil society broadly stands up and resists that you can have an effective resistance to a government that is intent on achieving its goal of undermining any kind of opposition. That is something that requires daily work. It requires work of many, many people, and you never know exactly how it's going to unfold. But that has to happen.
Lee Bollinger, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Toughen up. Those are the stern words of former President Obama to his fellow Democrats in the wake of President Trump's unpopular domestic policy bill. As the Democrats search for their way forward, Obama implored his party to stand up for the things that you know and you think are right. And Maryland Governor Wes Moore is committed to doing just that in his state. He speaks to Michelle Martin about how he's going to be doing it.
Thanks, Christiane. Governor Wes Moore, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So, Governor, obviously we wanted to talk to you. You're highly visible. You're the first Black governor of Maryland, but you're also in such close proximity to the nation's capital that you're experiencing what a lot of people are calling the Trump triple whammy. So why don't we start with just the whole economic picture? Maryland, by the state's own numbers, lost some 3,500 federal positions earlier this year, which is a big number in a state where nearly 7% of the working population is or was federally employed. So how are you thinking about this moment? How are you thinking about navigating this?
There's no doubt this is a really challenging moment because Maryland has a greater level of exposure to these federal cuts than any other state inside the country. You know, you mentioned I have over 260,000 federal jobs. Federal employees in the state of Maryland, over 160,000 federal jobs within the state of Maryland. So when we're talking about things like cuts to the NIH, when we're talking about cuts to Social Security, you know, these aren't just real institutions that serve people within our country. These are oftentimes Marylanders who are now losing their jobs. And so we just been have to be very aggressive and very thoughtful about ways we can support our federal workers. And, we were the first state in the country to announce a platform called the Feds to Eds, which is basically saying if a person is a laid off federal worker and they have an interest and also a skill set to become an educator, to become a teacher in the state of Maryland, then we were going to streamline that process, cut the red tape, get them inside of classrooms. And already we've seen that even in these first months, that initiative alone has been able to cut about 10% of our teacher shortage that existed in the state of Maryland, that we've been working with our private sector partners to be able to identify how can we make sure that those skills that Marylanders utilize can actually fulfill their needs as well. And thus far, we're really proud of the results where Maryland is one of the fastest job growth rates in the entire country, that our unemployment rate right now is 3.2%, which is more than a full point lower than the national average. So I'm really proud that Maryland has really helped to meet this moment, despite the fact that the relationship between the federal government and our states has really been severed.
The other thing about Maryland, it's a very diverse state. I mean, it's got urban centers, but it also has rural areas. Right. These Medicaid cuts that are part of the president's sort of big tax and spend bill. Now, the Republicans don't call it cuts, but everybody else calls them cuts because, these work requirements, the working assumption is that these work requirements will cause certain people to be dropped from the rolls, and also just the reimbursement rates. I mean, it's a very technical issue, but the concern is that hospitals, particularly in more rural areas, will not be able to make it. Is that a concern of yours?
It's a very real concern. And this is a devastating hit, particularly to our rural hospitals. And you're absolutely right. The number one industry in the state of Maryland is agriculture. And so rural supports, rural hospitals are crucial to our economic growth and our economic advancement, in addition to our healthcare. And, I was actually just recently out in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, speaking to folks, because we just finished making a historic investment in rural hospitals, both in the Eastern Shore and also in Western Maryland. And despite the fact that we on the state level, my administration, just made historic investments in rural healthcare, we're now seeing that the Trump administration is now proposing cutting about $250 million from Maryland's rural hospitals. So this is not even an inconvenience for our rural healthcare industries. This is an existential question that you have for many of our hospitals. And that means, does a person have the ability to get not just specialized care, but just basic primary care? Do they have a chance to get that without having to travel an hour and a half to go get it? And so there's a deep level of unfairness that exists in the way that this bill was structured, and it's going to have a significant impact on our rural communities.
Is there anything that you could do about it? I mean, some states are obviously trying to develop kind of a rural health fund. In fact, there's an element of that in the bill that does offer some support for rural hospitals, but it's it sounds like a big number. It's about $50 billion, but it's nowhere near the amount that actually would be cut. It's like about a third of that amount. So that, again, that's arithmetic, not calculus. So is there any way for the state to make up that difference?
Well, you just said it best. It's arithmetic, not calculus. I mean, that fund that was being proposed is almost offensive when you look at that in comparison to the cuts that are then going to happen to rural healthcare. And the truth is that there's not a single state, to include Maryland, that has the resources to be able to make up for when the federal government just decides to cut themselves out of a process. When the federal government basically looks at all of our states and says, you're on your own, and looks at the American people and says, you're on your own. And so this is damaging, and we are getting creative. We will continue to be thoughtful. And as we say in the state of Maryland, we leave no one behind. Yet at the same time, there is no state that has the balance sheet to just simply make up for when the federal government decides that they're no longer willing to engage.
There have been a number of pain points for Maryland specifically. One is that, the FBI headquarters was scheduled to move to Maryland. It's a long-term project because it's a huge facility, and the Trump administration decided that no, they wanted the headquarters to remain in the District of Columbia. Yeah. The football team is supposed to be leaving, Maryland for Washington, D.C. as well. And one of your big amusement parks is closing. And so, these are not things that you could not have anticipated when you ran for governor. You think, wow, I'm going to, not to mention the Key Bridge, one of your major transportation hubs, the Key Bridge, in this freak accident that caused death and, significant impediments. Now, on the plus side, you, with the help of federal partners, were able to get that bridge, at least a workaround, up and running in far less time than people had anticipated, which has to be a point of pride. But on the other hand, these are also some real economic blows, which you could not have anticipated at the time you ran for governor. So the question then becomes is, how do you navigate all that at the same time?
I think one thing that the people of the state of Maryland knew when they elected me as governor is they knew they were electing a soldier. My background is not in politics. My background is actually in the private sector, and also I led soldiers in Afghanistan. And the thing that I always learned was that the only thing that is predictable is expect the unpredictable, is that things are going to change. And one thing, and you're absolutely right, we came in realizing and learning on our first days, not just of realizing the structural deficit that we inherited, but also looking at the other fiscal realities that were coming on board. And to include things like, to your point, that the FBI building, which Maryland worked for a decade and worked through GSA to be able to get it done, that I was notified that the Trump administration was not planning on putting the FBI building in the state of Maryland, not because we were called, not because they reached out, but because I received a Washington Post news alert that he said it randomly in a press conference. So this is the dynamic that we have when it comes to the relationship with the federal government, which is deeply frustrating. But the thing I tell the people of my state is this: despite that, when I was first inaugurated, Maryland was 43rd in the country in unemployment. Now we're going on 16 straight months of amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country. That we went from being one of the deadliest states where you saw the homicide rate in the state of Maryland nearly double over an 8-year period before I became the governor. Now we're having amongst the fastest drops in violent crime, not just in the country, but in history. And so the people of our state know that even when crisis comes, is that we know how to lead and we know how to deliver.
Well, also, though, it has to be said, you're calling these investments, your critics call this a massive tax and spend kind of spree. The minority leader, the Maryland State House minority leader, and about 20 GOP legislators describe the fiscal 2026 budget as a massive tax and spend budget. And he says that any attempt to couch this as a tax cut budget is just inaccurate. How do you respond to that?
I say it's accurate because numbers don't lie. I say that 94% of Marylanders either just got a tax cut or so no change in their taxes at all. The majority of Marylanders, middle-class Marylanders, actually just got a tax cut, and the numbers are irrefutable. And the people who we did ask to invest more, frankly, the overwhelming majority of anyone who saw a tax increase were millionaires. And I do not have an issue. We worked with everybody across the economic spectrum. I do not have a problem asking millionaires to pay a little bit more so we can invest in having the best public schools in the country, that we can pay a little bit more to invest. And so we're not laying off police officers and not laying off firefighters. And we're continuing to lead one of the fastest drops in violent crime anywhere in the United States of America. And so, I prioritize the middle class. And if you look at what happened on the federal side, with the Republican budget, that budget prioritized millionaires. And it literally is the largest consolidation of wealth in world history. That's what they just passed, giving millionaires a tax cut so they could cut benefits for working families. And so in Maryland, I've just decided that we are going to move differently than that we are going to actually make sure we're giving the middle class a break, that we're going to give working families a break. And yes, we are going to ask people who have done very, very well to be able to invest a little bit more so we could have the type of society that each one of us can believe in and each one of us can benefit from. And
forgive me, Governor, is the calculation here that whenever the tax increase is in Maryland is going to be offset by the tax cut on the federal side, so that the higher earners are basically, it's going to be a wash? Is that part of the calculation here?
Well, the thing we know is that in this most recent budget in Maryland, there's about $2.5 billion worth of cuts in Maryland's budget. I'm the first governor now in over a decade to actually have 3 straight years of decreasing the size of the general fund, basically decreasing the size of state government. And this is the largest cut to the state budget that we've seen in 16 years. So we've shown a very real measure of discipline and modernization and frugalness when it comes to how government is spending. Yet at the same time, you are absolutely right that the people in Maryland who are being asked to invest a little bit more are also the ones who the Trump administration just said, and here's more money, here's your tax cut.
There's always the question of there's what the numbers show, and then there's what people feel. Yeah. Is your argument that these investments, as you consider them, or spending, as the Republicans would say, are going to improve the quality of life in Maryland to the point where people will feel it? Is that your argument?
Absolutely. And I think they already have, where you are now seeing, for example, in public education, where our third grade reading scores have jumped 20 states since I have been the governor. That we have now seen how public safety and violent crime has had amongst the fastest drops in our state's history. That we're seeing population increases in Baltimore City. You're seeing the largest population increases that we have seen in recent history. And so I think we are showing that you can be an efficient government. You can streamline, you can focus on modernization, where one of the first hires I made as governor was I actually hired both a chief innovation officer and focusing on modernization and really focusing on streamlining, cutting costs, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse in a humane way. And so I think people in the state of Maryland are seeing that our investments are actually working, that our strategy is actually working. And yes, at a time when the federal government is forcing increased prices on everything for working families, we believe that working families and middle-class families actually deserve a tax cut.
So let's talk about that homicide drop in Baltimore. I mean, the city recorded just 68 homicides through June, the lowest in 50 years. That's like a 23% drop from just the first half of 2024. Now, obviously, you're not the mayor, of Baltimore, but what do you attribute that decline to? What do you think was the state's role in this?
Well, I think, the state played a really important role, especially when it came to coordinating with our local leaders and the mayor and the state's attorneys and local law enforcement. We made the largest investments in local law enforcement in our state's history, that we've invested in predictive analytics and technologies to be able to stop crime before it happens. And if someone commits a crime, particularly with a violent crime with a handgun, I want them in handcuffs in 24 hours. And we've been able to invest in community intervention groups and stop retaliatory violence. The most violent year recorded in Baltimore's history was 2022, the year before I became the governor. Now, the least violent year in recorded recent history is now 2025, 2 years into our governorship. And so we've been able to fundamentally break the back of violence.
That sounds like a correlation, not a causation. I'm asking you, what's the cause?
Well, I think the cause is that we've actually started working together. And so we put more boots on the ground. We've invested in local law enforcement. We've been able to invest in technology, that we've been able to we're one of the few states that actually puts capital into the U.S. attorney from balance sheet, that we've been able to focus on juvenile justice reform and be able to have real focus on supporting and elevating our youth and focus on issues of poverty and employment. And so I think we've been able to take an all the above approach to include the fact that we've been able to put, additional $50 million into the Baltimore Police Department. Those type of things do make a market impact. And I think you've been able to see where we have gone from in 2022, the most violent year in Baltimore's history, to essentially now having the last time the homicides rate were this low in Baltimore City, I wasn't born yet. And you're seeing it not just in Baltimore City, you're seeing it all across the state of Maryland. So it's really encouraging results, but we also just know we're not done yet.
Before we let you go, what do you see as your role right now, particularly at a time when Democrats, on the whole, nationally, are not that happy with their leadership? They don't feel that they've taken an aggressive stance in addressing the things where there are strong disagreements with the Trump administration. Many people don't think they've been effective in opposing things with which Democrats profoundly disagree. Do you see yourself as having a particular role right now? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think my role is to do what we're doing, which is delivering results for the people of Maryland. That's why they elected me. They did not elect me to revive the Democratic Party. They did not elect me to be able to, talk about things that should be happening in other places. They elected me because we could do things like have record drops in violent crime. They elected me because we could have things like record drops in unemployment. They elected me because we could focus on making Maryland the first state in the country that now has a service year option for all of our high school graduates. And as you mentioned earlier, that we could, be able to accomplish a clearing of the federal channel after the Key Bridge collapse in record speed. I think the people are seeing that in the state of Maryland and in my administration, we don't do no and slow. We do yes and now. And we make sure we're providing real opportunities to provide pathways to work, wages, and wealth for the people of our state. And so the fact that people around the country are paying attention to the results that we're driving in the state of Maryland is very humbling. And I deeply appreciate it. I also just know that the way you win elections is by actually doing what you say you're going to do. And that's exactly what we've done in the state of Maryland.
Who do you like for president in 2028 as a Democrat? Thoughts?
I think right now, for anyone who is paying attention to 2028, it means you're not paying attention to 2025. We've got real issues going on right now. We have essentially a full assault that's taking place from our federal government on the people of our state, on our federal workers, on families with disabilities, on our seniors, on our students. And so I think anyone who is paying attention to what's going to happen in 2028, they're not paying attention to what's happening right now in 2025.
Is this job what you thought it would be?
I love this job. I love this job because it's having a chance every single day to make policies that you have thought about, dreamed about, and have a chance to see them in action is really exciting. And again, we spend all of our time out in communities, out in neighborhoods all over the state, Western Maryland, the Eastern Shore, everywhere in between. And to see the people of our state knowing that they have a fighter and excited that they have a fighter as their governor is just very humbling.
Governor Westmore, thank you so much for talking with us.
Now, outrage over the surging presence of federal agents in Minneapolis continues as the United States reels from the deadly shooting of Renee Good by an ICE officer last week. Minnesota and Illinois are now suing the Trump administration, while new calls to defund ICE are emerging amongst Democrats. But what about actual accountability for Good's death? 6 federal prosecutors quit yesterday after the Justice Department pushed for a criminal investigation into Renee Good's widow. Mike Fox is a legal fellow at the Cato Institute, and in a new article, he highlights that this tragedy and its aftermath are part of a wider trend of federal impunity, as he tells Hari Srinivasan.
Christian, thanks. Mike Fox, thanks so much for joining us. Just this past week, Renee Good was shot and killed on a residential street in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent named Jonathan Ross. You wrote recently in an op-ed something that kind of caught our eye, which was that this is part of a pattern. And tell us, what is that pattern?
Yeah, Hari, good to be here. Thanks for having me. So, it's difficult to get data from the government, from Border Patrol, from ICE, from the Department of Homeland Security. There's been a pretty good investigative report from the Wall Street Journal, and then I took what they wrote and tried to parse through. And from what I can gather, since July, the immigration enforcement, be it ICE or Border Patrol, have shot 13 times at individuals in cars Of those, they've hit 8 people, 2, including Renee Good, were killed. So one of the patterns that's emerged in these cases is as soon as the government shoots someone in a vehicle, and by the government, I'm referring to ICE and Border Patrol, the propaganda machine, Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin, who's the communications guru for the Department of Homeland Security, starts, trying to frame the narrative in a way that the agents are always right and the civilians are always wrong, trying to sanitize their hands, paint the person who was shot at as being some horrific, violent criminal. They were already calling Renee Good a domestic terrorist, taking the side of the officers who were accused of killing them. The reality is, there were many instances where this is what Ms. McLaughlin was saying, and it's been objectively false, and it's been proven false. We've seen a number of instances where she's alleged people have committed these heinous crimes only for the cases to fall apart the second they get into court.
One of the things that you wrote about that I want to highlight for our audience, you said, the tragedy of the Good case is compounded by a legal regime that all but ensures federal agents remain untouchable by civil damages lawsuits. If Good's surviving family members attempt to sue Ross and the agents involved in her shooting for violating her civil rights, they will almost certainly find no remedy in a courtroom. How?
It's pretty clear. If you pull the Department of Homeland Security use of force guidelines, which were last updated in 2023, ICE and Border Patrol are bound by those guidelines. They're required to follow them. It's also pretty obvious that ICE and the Department of Homeland Security are not going to take any remedial measures. They're not going to punish him, dock his pay, fire him, do anything like that. So the only other ways that would be to hold him or other agents, federal agents, accountable for constitutional violations would be criminal case, which is obviously, we're not going to see the Trump administration federally prosecute this, and prosecuting at the state level poses a number of legal challenges. And that's assuming that the investigators from the federal investigators with the FBI even cooperate with the state investigators to give them the evidence and the transcripts of interviews and body cam footage and things that would be necessary to pursue a criminal case, which they pretty clearly are trying to screen Minnesota investigators out of. So civil damages would be what most people think. And what that is that's the ability to go into court and seek money damages when your constitutional rights have been violated. In 1871, Congress passed a law that's commonly known as Section 1983. And that law was passed following the Civil War. There were newly freed slaves in the South who had all these wonderful rights on paper, but as they went to vindicate them or to exercise them, they were finding state and local officials in the South were precluding those rights from being exercised. So Congress passed this law allowing private citizens to go into court and seek monetary damages against state and local officials. That has never been extended to the federal government. And if you think about why, it kind of makes sense, right? At the time in the 1870s, the ones violating the Constitution were the states and local governments in the South. They were not the federal government. But also historically, the federal government's been one of enumerated powers. It's very small, was never intended to do a whole lot. Flash forward about 100 years, and the federal government is involved in every aspect of our lives. So in 1965, there's a gentleman named Webster Bivens. Webster Bivens is in his Brooklyn apartment, minding his own business, when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the precursor to the DEA or the Drug Enforcement Administration, barged in without a warrant, strip searched him, and made an arrest. Mr. Bivens decided to take his case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And 6 years later, the court read an implied right of action to sue federal officials for Fourth Amendment violations. Over the years, the court extended it a little bit, but the court over the past few decades has become increasingly reluctant to extend Bivens. Some of the more conservative justices want to actually get rid of it entirely. There were 2 cases within the past decade or so where the court just could have extended Bivens to immigration enforcement contexts, and both times the court did not do so, citing unfounded national security concerns. It's also worth noting, of course, that the cases that we're talking about now, by and large, don't even deal with immigration enforcement. Ms. Good was a U.S. citizen. They deal with street level policing. But because the court has so withered away Bivens and never extended it to the immigration context, and because the statutory cause of action, Section 1983, only applies to state and local actors, if your constitutional rights are violated by federal agents like ICE agents or Border Patrol agents, you are without recourse to get into federal court. And the other point that I would make is on the off chance that you somehow get into federal court, like in some utopian world where I become a federal judge and allow the case to proceed, you're still not going to get recourse because there's this doctrine known as qualified immunity. And that doctrine was created by the Supreme Court in the 1960s, and it stands in direct contradiction of the statute I mentioned earlier called Section 1983. And what qualified immunity does is it says that unless you can identify a case where the exact same thing happened in the exact same jurisdiction, so unless Ms. Good's family could go into court and prove that an ICE agent violated someone else's rights in the exact same way that their loved one's rights were violated in the Eighth Circuit, which is where Minnesota stands, they have no redress. And of course, qualified immunity only matters if Congress were to codify Bivens, or if the court were to recognize a implied right to sue federal immigration agents in the first place. So these two doctrines working together make it all but impossible to ever get into federal court seeking civil damages.
If I'm hearing you correctly, her family would have more rights for recourse if it was a Minneapolis police officer or a state police officer that did this, right? And you're saying that given the way that the laws are structured today, a federal agent can, in broad daylight, shoot someone and not be held accountable depending on the administration's interests.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's say instead of being shot by an ICE agent, she was shot by a Minneapolis police officer, right? She could sue. She could then get into federal court. She could bring a cause of action under Section 1983. Of course, unless she could find another case in the Eighth Circuit where someone's rights were violated in exactly the same way, the officer will likely benefit from qualified immunity. So it's a monumental battle.
Yeah.
But at least there's a way to initially get into court. Whereas with the federal agent for constitutional violations, there's not. And yeah, I think most people are shocked when they see the impunity that federal agents can act with. They can literally gun a woman down on a public street in broad daylight and face absolutely zero semblance of accountability. That should shock people to the core.
Tell me a little bit about the other cases that have happened, including some shootings. I mean, there's a shooting of Carlitos Ricardo Parias last October in South Los Angeles. Another case of a woman named Marimar Martinez, who was shot by Border Patrol agents in Chicago. What happened in these cases, and how do they fit the pattern that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so both of those cases you mentioned are notable, and they both had their cases dismissed. Ms. Martinez was stopped had an encounter in Chicago where the government again alleged that she tried to run officers or federal agents off the road, tried to ram them, justifying them to shoot at her. Interestingly enough, there was video that showed that the agents actually tried to surround or ram her vehicle. To my knowledge, that has not been made public. I have not seen it. But the government moved to dismiss the case, which the judge granted. And then in the other case that you mentioned, Mr. Carlitos, he had his case dismissed by a federal judge, by a U.S. District Court judge, because the government was not complying with discovery obligations. They would not turn over body camera footage timely. I believe they were also impeding his ability to interface with counsel and assist in his own defense. These are some egregious constitutional violations. So I want to, emphasize that it's not just ICE and Border Patrol who hold responsibility here. It's also federal prosecutors. I was a public defender. I was never a prosecutor. But I can tell you, if I want to bring the full weight of the federal government down on someone, I want to be sure that the agents who are alleging what they did are credible, and be sure that the conduct that they allege actually happened and that I can prove it in court, right? So if I'm later discovering videos that exonerate someone, ICE should not be charging them in the first place. Thankfully, federal judges are by and large faithful adherents to the Constitution, are putting a stop to it.
I just want to get your reaction to a statement that Tricia McLaughlin made to Time Magazine after this shooting. It said it's a pattern of vehicles being used as weapons by violent agitators to attack our law enforcement. Dangerous criminals, whether they be illegal aliens or U.S. citizens, are assaulting law enforcement and turning their vehicles into weapons to attack law enforcement. Within minutes and hours of an incident, you see the spokespeople or even leadership coming out before there is an opportunity for everyone just to get the facts on the ground of what happened. I mean, is that strategic and tactical?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the end goal is to try to make the government look like the good guys and make anyone they deal with look bad, look like a domestic terrorist, portray a certain perspective. They're professional agitators. They're people with extensive criminal histories. Now, has ICE and Border Patrol arrested some violent offenders with extensive criminal histories? Oh, yeah. There's some cases ongoing for serious charges. I would note, though, that not a single one of these cases that I mentioned coming from July has resulted in a criminal conviction or a guilty plea. Now, of course, that could be because it's only January and cases can take a long time to move. But there's been 4 cases already that I'm aware of where cases have been dismissed. There's been several where they've yet to be filed. It's just a matter of what matters most. Does following the Constitution and vindicating people's rights matter? Or does framing the narrative that Stephen Miller wants pushed around the country and Gregory Bovino wants people to believe is true matter more than the Constitution? I think it's pretty clear which the answer is here.
So right now, you are also seeing lawsuits from the state of Minnesota and the state of Illinois against the federal government. They're claiming, among several things, look, this is a violation of the 10th Amendment. I mean, we are having to push all of our police officers to all these different events instead of the jobs that they need to do, and that the federal agents are terrorizing communities. Now, what's the likelihood that lawsuits like this against the federal government go forward?
Yeah, so it's important to distinguish. So these lawsuits are seeking injunctive relief. What they're doing is they're asking a federal judge, in this case, the state of Minnesota, the state of Illinois, are asking a federal judge. We've seen these cases happen in other jurisdictions. Cato Institute just filed an amicus brief in support of a challenge in Kern County, California, in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. What they're asking is they're asking a federal judge to issue an injunction barring the agencies from operating as they are, from violating the Constitution prolifically, from terrorizing civilians, and just all they're really asking is for the agencies to follow the law and do what they're supposed to do. From what I understand, the Attorney General of Minnesota simply wants ICE to conduct immigration enforcement, which is what ICE is supposed to do. I don't think that's in any way unreasonable. Now, the question as to how successful these lawsuits are going to be depends, right? We've seen some cases where there's been success in the lower courts. I think eventually the Supreme Court's going to have to deal with the merits of these cases. And, by and large, there'll be different questions. The questions in some of them is, can the government stop people or seize people on account of something like ethnicity and the fact that they're outside a Home Depot or working at a farm? If you open the Constitution, the answer couldn't be clearer. We don't live in a world where your Fourth Amendment rights depend upon the color of your skin or what country you were born in. Unfortunately, not everyone agrees with that. And then you have other questions like, are the courts going to be willing to stop what's going on in Minnesota and what's going on in Illinois? I certainly hope so, right? The courts are really our last line of defense here.
But is there anything that Congress can do to constrain how federal troops act on U.S. soil?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not talking about federal troops as in the military. I'm talking about ICE and Border Patrol. Yeah. So Congress controls the power of the purse, right? Congress can give ICE and Border Patrol as much or as little money as they would like, right? Obviously, if Congress were to cut their budget in half, that would dramatically impede their ability to do what they're doing. That would be one way Congress could do it, right? Other things Congress could do is pass laws that have, aggressive enforcement mechanisms. Like, for instance, ICE and Border Patrol agents cannot categorically, under any circumstance, wear a mask or balaclava on the job. They must have their name and employer on them at all times. But those policies alone don't accomplish anything because the government just ignores them. So you would have to tie it into something. Well, if they don't follow it, they lose X amount of funding, or if they don't follow it, at any time there's some type of proceeding that gets brought in court, there's an inference against the agent or something like that. That's one thing that we could do. The other thing, and I think the most important thing Congress can do, is codify, expand Bivens, and abolish qualified immunity. So together, what that would say is if your rights are violated by a federal agent, you can go into federal court, you can sue under whatever statute this would be that Congress would create. And by the way, the agents do not get qualified immunity. So that question will actually go to a jury. And a jury is the body that the framers intended to adjudicate disputes between citizens and their government. So in cases like Ms. Goods, what jurors would be asked to deal with is something like, was the force used by Officer Ross objectively reasonable under the circumstances? So they could ask questions like, is jumping in front of or walking in front of a moving vehicle contributing to the danger? And is that something that should be considered? These are questions that jurors are supposed to get to decide. But instead, because we don't have a way to get these cases to them, they're not able to do that.
Right now, I think the perception is that the president has the authority and the control of several troops that should be along the border, to be in the middle of the country. Obviously, we understand that he's the commander in chief and he can have military operations take place overseas. But right now, I don't know who should be in charge of this level of deployment. If you have 1,000, 2,000 new agents coming into a specific community.
Of course, the president does have the power to decide how to deploy federal agents and in what capacity. But that power is not unlimited. It's constrained by the Constitution. He can't just do whatever they want, unleash agents into communities with orders to terrorize people and openly flout the Constitution, right? So that is not an absolute power. And of course, Congress controls the power of the purse, right? If Congress wanted to put in a no funds may be spent to deploy agents to cities, they could easily do that. It's not in a lack of ability. It's a lack of desire.
Legal fellow of the Cato Institute Project on Criminal Justice, Mike Fox. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.